in aerospace as well as working in the United States Air Force, how important it is, and I will bring that knowledge to the table.
I've been called a lot of things, but I've never been called a Washington insider. I think Bill Clinton would disagree vehemently with that. Newt Gingrich, who I opposed on a number of occasions, would disagree with that as well. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe I misheard what Barry just said. You know, if you face a very serious problem in Washington, one that goes to the heart of our nation's defense, which involves a very complex process, not just within the Congress, in both houses, but within the administration, cutting across many departments of the government, that the adage in Washington is give it to somebody that doesn't have any idea what they're doing and has just gotten here. That's a new one on me. And I hate to tell y'all, but that ain't gonna work. I mean, working through the BRAC process, working through a process in which this administration hides and camouflages their cuts to personnel, to R&D, to authorizations, to appropriations for authorizations that have already been made, takes a great deal of skill. You have to know by having been there, being there, talking with people, not just who are freshmen, but who have been there, committee chairs. Back when I served in the House previously, Barry, there was a serious move by the Republicans to cut back the C-130J program significantly. And I had to go repeatedly to the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee and to the Speaker himself to argue against those cuts, which we were able to get removed. That doesn't happen simply by saying, oh, I'm new here and have a new perspective. It comes from knowing where to go, who to go to, and in my case, using, as I will have when I go up there, not 0 years and being a fresh face, I've never been accused of that either, but going up there and having 8 years of seniority where it really matters, and that is to work the issues, Joe, that you're talking about.
So let me finish just with the concept on military. Having traveled the country, I have to say that it is sickening to see what has happened to our veterans, the veterans hospitals. And I'm candidly embarrassed by it. What would you do as a member of the Congress to get to the bottom of it, but also to hold people accountable for who let this happen? There.
My heart breaks when I see what's happened to our veterans. I've lost friends during Desert Storm, and I had friends go to the desert and come back and permanently maimed, and I saw many of my colleagues that were in the military during the time I was serving to get out on full disability. Their life was changed forever, but they went out with the confidence that the United States of America would live up to its contractual obligation to them and would provide them with the health care that they needed. To know that veterans of this nation have died waiting on service, our nation has let them down. We have to get to the bottom of what's happened. But we have to have cooperation from the White House, which emphatically we can't even get to the bottom of Benghazi. I'm not sure we're going to get to the bottom of what happened in this event. In fact, we may get somewhere within Benghazi because who they just appointed to be head of that committee is a good friend and a supporter of our campaign, Trey Gowdy. If anybody can get to the bottom of it, he can. But Congress has to dedicate itself not only to getting to the bottom of this and prosecuting those who were at fault, but we have to come up with new solutions. We just can't keep reinventing the wheel. Folks, what you see in the VA is what you're going to get with socialized medicine through Obamacare. We have to come up with better solutions. One idea that we need to explore is a voucher system. Give our veterans a voucher to go to a community hospital, to one of our hospitals, to where you get good health care. Why should our veterans suffer to have substandard health care when we can give them a voucher and probably save this country a whole lot of taxpayer money? That's one idea that we need to explore, and those are those fresh and new ideas that need to be brought to Congress.
What we're witnessing here with the scandal, and it's scandal with a capital S, what we're witnessing here with the scandal in the Veterans Administration, the Department of Veterans Affairs, goes beyond negligence. It goes beyond bureaucratic inertia. It goes beyond a lack of caring. It is criminal. When you look simply at the information that we have seen public, and my rule of thumb as President Reagan's prosecutor down here is what you see publicly in terms of the evidence is the tip of the iceberg. But what we have seen just with that tip of the iceberg, that is the public information regarding the scope of this scandal, convinces me that there are criminal offenses that have occurred and may even be continuing to this day as part of what one could call, and may very well depend on the evidence, a RICO case against individuals within the Veterans Administration. There's a lot that can be done, and we have to get done. I have written to the House leadership, for example, and called for a select committee with the explicit purpose to immediately begin a focused investigation using the full subpoena power and contempt power that the House has as a co-equal branch of the government to vest in one single committee the jurisdiction of about 5 different committees to focus the effort. We can't wait for 5 different committees to do this. I also believe it is essential that the Attorney General appoint a special prosecutor to investigate the criminal allegations regarding Veterans Administration. And going down the road beyond addressing this scandal and potential criminal enterprise that is going on, we need to make serious reforms through putting veterans in charge of the Veterans Administration and not bureaucrats.
I believe both of you are opposed to amnesty for those who are in this country illegally. But would you favor a new pathway to legal status for them that would allow them to stay in the country yet not be on the fast track to citizenship? And the second part of this question is, let's talk about legal immigration for just a moment. Are there any circumstances under which you would vote to increase legal immigration and guest worker programs?
One of the things, Joe, that we need to do, and I know that both you and Randy have studied this, as many in our audience have. I know D.A. King is here this evening and has studied this and advocates very strongly and very eloquently for meaningful, real strict enforcement of our immigration laws. There is no way that we need, or that I would ever support, a new pathway to citizenship. I mean, it's a non-starter, a non-sequitur. There is a pathway to citizenship that's laid out in the law based on the constitutional power of the federal government over immigration and the criteria for citizenship. What we do need, and in talking with businesses not only all across the 11th district through our Small Business Advisory Council, but businesses all across Georgia and even elsewhere in the country, as I've had the opportunity to do in recent years, they say it is ridiculous to be operating businesses in the 21st century with immigration laws that relate to lawful work permitting and visas that were crafted in the 1980s. So Congress has a responsibility that it has repeatedly failed to live up to revise and modernize and bring those immigration, work permitting, and visa laws and regulations to meet the criteria, the business needs of businesses here in the 21st century. And that has nothing to do with the underlying and fundamentally essential proposition to secure our border. And it has nothing to do, and should have nothing to do, with citizenship. But to make very clear, I would not favor any amnesty or any new pathway to citizenship, however you sugarcoat it, however you say it, whatever language you say it in.
Well, this has been one of the areas that I have been very, very consistent in during my time period in the state legislature as co-author and supporter of many pieces of legislation to ensure that taxpayer dollars do not go in any way, shape, form, or fashion to support those that are illegally here in this nation. Your question about permanent legal status, there's a very dangerous bill that Congress has been considering, which is called the Enlist Act. Now, the Enlist Act changes a long-standing rule or law that we've had in this country, which is during times of war, someone who already has permanent legal status, not here illegally, but permanent legal status that is not a citizen of the United States, can enter into the armed forces. And if they complete their enlistment period and they get an honorable discharge, then they can seek a pathway to citizenship. What the Enlist Act would do would allow those that are illegally here to go into the military, which would give them a default fast track to permanent legal status, which would give them a pathway to citizenship. This is a backdoor way of providing a fast track or a backdoor path to citizenship, and we must stop the Enlist Act as well. We have to, that's one of the things when you're dealing with legislation, you just can't always look at what is that talking point of the day or what is that news item of the day. You have to look deep, you have to read every piece of legislation. I have been clear, crystal clear, that I oppose any pathway to citizenship. We have to secure the borders. I have been consistent on that. We should not have open borders and let anybody just come into this nation just because they go through a secure checkpoint. We also must ensure that we reform our immigration system and enforce the laws that we have on the book. It always amazes me where legislatures decide, well, we need a new law when we're not even enforcing the laws on the book. Secure the border, enforce the laws we have on the book, and fix a broken legal immigration system before we try to tackle anything else.
If I can break in and follow up very briefly. You both did a real good comprehensive job of answering the first part of my question, and I guess my question was too long and convoluted, so let me ask the second part of it again. Is there any circumstance under which you would vote to increase legal immigration and guest worker programs?
I guess that's my...
You can go and
Okay.
follow up.
One of the problems we have in this nation is we have overregulated a guest worker program that actually worked. I went to South Georgia. In fact, when we were looking at immigration in the state of Georgia, I just didn't want to haphazardly just take the front line and make the news saying I'm supporting this bill because we knew it was popular. We went and spent a week on the border learning the problems that we were having. When I came back, I went and I spent a day with South Georgia farmers to learn the problem. We have put so much red tape in the guest worker program that it no longer works for our farmers. We should have a workable guest worker program, one like we used to have before this administration started tinkering with it, one where the farmers would basically submit to ICE and how many workers they need. The foreign workers would submit to their governments, they would do a background check. The farmer goes to the border, he picks up the workers, he brings them back to the farm or whatever business is in, provides them with a place to live, a way to make their meals, and when their work period is over with, they are responsible to take them back to the border. What's happened is we have so mired this program with red tape and bureaucracy that many of those guest workers are afraid they're not going to get back into the nation. So they stay here. Thus, it adds to our illegal immigration problem. We must have a guest worker program that works. But let me tell you, if we were to enforce the laws we have on the books as they are now, which our president seems to just ignore most of the laws, we can fix most of the immigration problems without new legislation.
I'm not sure I heard an answer in there, but let me try and do a little clearer job of answering your question, Joe. As I mentioned in the answer to your question initially, we do need to bring our federal laws regarding work permitting and visas into the 21st century so that they meet the needs of 21st century businesses, not late 20th century businesses. And if that means adjusting and looking at the number of immigrant workers who want to come into this country lawfully under a work permit or visa in certain areas ought to be increased, and absolutely we ought to. And they may very well need to be decreased in other areas because those are not the areas that businesses now, as opposed to the 1980s, needed people. That's what we need. I was on the phone just last week with a friend of mine who owns a very successful landscaping business that landscapes in the entire Atlanta area and other states. And he was saying he wants to hire people. He wants work. He wants to bring tax revenue to Georgia. But because the laws, as they are currently crafted, do not allow him to bring in sufficient numbers of workers from abroad legally to meet that demand, he can't do it. So he's losing business. The community is losing tax resources. That's a perfect example of what needs to be done to even out our work permitting and visa system. And if in some areas we need to increase them, then yes. That is business oriented, that is pro-American, and it's pro-business, and we need to do it.
So I guess this starts with Congressman Barb. As Republicans, we all agree that the deficit, and spending is out of control. The issue, however, that divides our caucus in the U.S. House is how far to go. And the question I have for you is, in order to control spending, would you vote to again shut the government down? If so, why? And if not, why not?
When we had the budget battles, Randy, as you well remember, and you were very intimately involved in working those issues with us in the House back in the late 1990s with Clinton. Sometimes it is necessary to force a president to the negotiating table to refuse to pass bills that he wishes to pass reflecting the budget numbers that he wants. And when Tom DeLay was our majority whip, and Dick Armey was our majority leader, and Newt was our speaker, we had a team and a philosophy of governance that said, and we held the line on this, we will not allow and did not allow a single spending bill sought by the Clinton administration to come to the floor of the House for a vote. Now that precipitated a brief so-called government shutdown, which, as you know, wasn't really a government shutdown. It simply was a temporary cancellation of non-essential government services, which raises the question, why are we paying for them anyway? We'll leave that aside. So sometimes it is necessary to come to that point when an administration such as the Clinton administration and now the Obama administration refuses to properly and legitimately negotiate with the Republicans in the House, who are in the majority in the House, in order to be able to pass a budget and or a continuing resolution. So yes, it does become necessary sometimes when you have an administration that will not negotiate in good faith. Sometimes that's the only way, and we have to take it then.
We're talking about a debt. Because of Congress's deficit spending, a small businessman, I at least have the common sense to know that you can't spend more than you take in without going bankrupt. We have increased this debt to unbelievable amounts, $18 trillion by the end of this fiscal year. To give you an idea of how much $18 trillion is, if you go back to the birth of Christ and you put $16,000 in the bank every 60 seconds, you still wouldn't have $18 trillion today. Just the interest payment on that debt could have bought 2,700 F-35 fighter planes, and they cost $151 million apiece. This is a national security issue. Sometimes you have to take a hard stand. When I was in Washington, D.C., when FreedomWorks named me one of the top 5 most conservative candidates in the nation, we addressed this issue. And I said the problem we have in the House of Representatives is really a leadership problem more than anything. Because the Republicans are putting their finger in the air. They're seeing which way the wind is blowing, and sometimes you just have to make the hard stand. The problem we have is our Republican brethren have been more interested in staying in power than doing anything with the power. And sometimes you just have to make a solid and bold stand. And you know what? Do sort of like the Democrats did to get Obamacare. It should have never passed. It was the most unpopular bill in modern history. But how did they pass it? Because Nancy Pelosi was willing to sacrifice her speakership for a cause she believed in. That's what we need to be doing as Republicans. Sometimes you have to make a stand, and yes, in that instance, I believe we would have to make a stand or make a stand and say no. We will not continue to expand this debt ceiling and further put our children in jeopardy.
I want to talk for a minute about Iraq and ask you about that. Many people feel that by pulling our troops out prematurely for self-serving political reasons, President Obama has squandered the victory that George Bush finally won in Iraq. And meanwhile, we're not exactly winning the war in Afghanistan either. And that sort of puts Obama on the brink of being the first U.S. president ever to lose 2 wars. With that victory in Iraq now crumbling, what would you advise him to do in Iraq? And in light of the debacle in Iraq, should we step up or pull out from Afghanistan? And I forget which one of you it's supposed to go.
I think that's my turn. Okay. Well, let me tell you, that's a question that I take close to heart because my son, my youngest son, is an airborne pathfinder. And he's susceptible to be deployed into any of these fields of battle. But when he enlisted in the United States Army, he took a oath of office. And it's our responsibility to make sure that when we send our young men and women into harm's way, that they're there for the right reason. We have to have a clear and present danger to the security of the United States. This is a tough call because I was speaking with someone today when we were out doing some campaigning, and he told me that a friend of his who was in Iraq during the war of Iraq called him and he said, "I now know what my Vietnam brethren felt when they saw the fall of Saigon." I feel like what we have done it not. If there is a clear and present danger that Iraq poses, we must intervene on behalf of the safety and security of the United States. But if it does not, then we should not be engaged. I can't answer that question right now because unlike when I was in the military, I was in intelligence and I had more of the information during that time period. But we must set very clear criteria of when do we intervene and when do we put our young men in harm's way. As far as Afghanistan, we should have learned our lesson from the Soviets. That is a war that I think we are not going to win. We must, and one of the problems that we never had a clear objective. Going into that, as being in the military, we had to know what our objectives were before we went in, or at least to continue to sustain. The Taliban is still there, as we have learned in the last week. But I do think, without a clear objective, it's time to pull our troops back out of Afghanistan. There are much more hostile enemies that we are facing today.
Was the question, how would I advise the president?
Yeah, if he said, "Bob, what should I do about Iraq?" what would you tell him? And what would you tell him about Afghanistan?
Well, what I would tell Obama is resign now and avoid impeachment. You're in way over your head. Every day you stay in office, you are harming the fabric, the economy of this country, and our nation's security, not just for this year, not just for next year, but for the next generation. And setting the example of cutting and running and not even having the ability to stand before the American people 2 days ago, when all of this was unfolding, even he had to have read about it in the newspapers, for him to then say, "Well, gee, I'll have to study that." For heaven's sake, he's the President of the United States, and he can't make up his mind what to do when he sees some of the most radical militants on the face of the earth that are so radical, Al-Qaeda won't even have them, marching by the thousands right through the heart of Iraq, through Mosul, to Crete, Nineveh, all the way down, now almost to the walls of Baghdad. And he doesn't know what to do? I mean, that is absolutely disgraceful. Meanwhile, there are reports that we are leaving American contractors there to fend for themselves, people that we asked to go over there to help out with the effort. Specifically, though, if he doesn't take my advice to resign, then I would advise him to use the airstrike capability that we have, both manned and drone capability, in this situation. The targets are clear. There's very little danger with these folks marching down the highway of collateral damage, as they say, killing innocent civilians. They provide a perfect target. We have the weaponry to do it for surgical airstrikes and drone strikes. This is one area where I would support the use of drones.
So in 2012, crazy Uncle Joe said, Bin Laden is dead and GM is alive. And what we know 2 years later is that Al-Qaeda is still deadly and so is GM. How would you reprioritize the focal point of the federal government, given these conflicting boundaries, which is to protect us from terror while simultaneously reviving our economy? Senator?
Could you repeat that one more time? I was thinking it was Bob.
I'm not going to repeat the whole thing.
Yeah. Just the question part.
Just the question part is, how would you balance the priorities between protecting Americans from terror while simultaneously reviving the economy?
Wow, that's two really broad subjects. How would you protect the citizens against terrorism and still and invigorate the economy? I mean, that's definitely a balance that we have to look at. The big problem we have is, where do we put our resources? Where are we spending our money? Well, the bailouts and TARP was an unconstitutional role of government. If you go back and you look at the founding of our nation, one of the issues that our founding fathers faced in 1776 was the British government bailing out a business that they deemed too big to fail and tax the colonists to pay for it. It was the East India Tea Company, who was on the verge of bankruptcy. And they determined, well, we need to bail them out because they're too important to the economy. Well, the founders didn't take that very well. They thought that was tyranny. And so they took all the tea and they dumped it in the harbor of Boston. Most people don't realize the history of the Boston Tea Party. National security is one of the constitutional roles of government. If you look in the Constitution, it is the predominant role of our government is national security. Funding our military is the highest priority that our government has. To stimulate the economy, it's pretty simple. Less government, not more government, less government, reduce the regulation. If you look at what's going on right now in Washington, D.C., our president is legislating from the White House through policies and procedures and regulation. Congress has to withdraw that from the president. They have to control him through the budgetary process and take that power back. So I don't think that there's really a conflict if we follow conservative Republican principles by reducing regulation and prioritizing our spending on defense. I hope that was kind of getting to the context of your question. It was pretty broad, but it was a good question.
Congressman?
We often think, I think in modern times, and we see, Randy, a number of court decisions, as you know, that are far too deferential to the president as the chief executive, as the so-called commander-in-chief, to have primacy in national security. I think one thing we've learned with this administration very clearly, and even to some extent with the prior administration, Congress has to reassert its role in our national security. You know, yes, every president likes to don the hat of commander-in-chief, and that's an important role and responsibility of the president. But actually, if I know you have, read the Constitution very carefully, the responsibilities, the specific enumerated responsibilities for deciding how our military is going to be funded, the responsibilities of the military, is vested in the Congress. The Congress needs to reassert its proper role to set those spending priorities and not let the administration constantly run roughshod over the Congress. That would help tremendously, because I think we'd see a much more, particularly in this case, where we have a commander-in-chief who has no business being the commander-in-chief, to be honest, where we have that situation, Congress does need to reassert its role. I think it's also important to keep in mind that we can and must protect our nation against terrorism without sacrificing our civil liberties here at home. That is extremely important. We don't need the NSA spying on virtually every email or every cell phone message that an American engages in. With regard to the economy, there is an awful lot that we can do that the Congress can do. I know a lot of folks like to say, well, we need a balanced budget amendment, we need an amendment for this, that, and the other thing. We don't. The tools are there. We've done it before. We balanced the budget. When I was a member of the House back in 1997, after being in the majority in the House for a mere 2.5 years, because we had leadership, we had vision, and we held an administration's feet to the fire over and over and over again and ensured that we brought that administration to the negotiating table and got a balanced budget. It's Congress's job. This administration won't do it. We need to do it in the Congress. I've been there, I've done it, I want to do it again.
If elected, and if things still stand as they do today, would you push to initiate impeachment proceedings against President Obama? Why or why not?
I believe that we have long ago passed the legitimate point, the responsible point of inquiring into whether impeachable offenses have occurred. Now that is very different, as you know and as I know, along with I think I had 17 fellow co-sponsors of the original inquiry of impeachment that I filed in the House on November 5th of 1997. But filing an inquiry of impeachment, which I believe is timely and appropriate now, simply says, we, the Congress, by jurisdiction vested in the Judiciary Committee of the House, believe that there is serious evidence that impeachable offenses may have occurred. We don't jump the gun and say they have occurred. We're going to file articles of impeachment. That would be irresponsible. But inquiring into it, absolutely. When you have a president that not only in the dead of night, but proudly proclaims to the American people that yes, I signed this law, but I'm not going to abide by it. Even laws that he himself passed through the urge that the Congress passed. When you have a president that clearly refuses to enforce laws and sends directives to his U.S. attorneys and to the Immigration Service not to enforce the laws and to flout the laws, then yes, I believe that we have passed that point where the Congress has a responsibility to inquire into whether impeachable offenses have occurred.
Yeah, I mean, I truly believe if you look at the complete, the president ignoring the constraints of the Constitution, he has violated the Constitution, he's violated his oath of office on several occasions, and even willfully ignores the laws of this nation. If we don't hold these people to accountable, then you'll just see a continual progression of this shift of power. Our founders put in place a balance of power, and we have to hold them accountable to that. And I agree that there has to be an inquiry into whether or not we could proceed with impeachment. The problem is, if Harry Reid is still in control of the Senate, it'll be a wasted exercise. I think when President Clinton went through impeachment hearings in the House, I believe we had a Republican Senate during that time, and